We are beginning a new book this evening, Jeremiah chapter 1. I think you're going to find a lot of what we're going to study in Jeremiah could have been written for us today. So everybody there, everybody in Jeremiah, if anybody needs a Bible, just slip up your hand and we'll give you the address of a good Christian bookstore so you can purchase a Bible. No, just kidding. So Jeremiah chapter 1. My goodness, this is a popular book. So Jeremiah was chosen by God before birth to be a prophet to the nations. So when we begin any book, we're going to give you a little history, a little background about that book. And so tonight's going to be more of an introduction into this book. And he was a prophet to the nations, especially to the nation of Judah. He was a prophet to the kings of Judah, to King Josiah, to King Jehoiakim, and to King Zedekiah. And so his ministry spanned 40-some years. All the kings who reigned in Judah during the ministry of Jeremiah, and there were 5 of them, and we're going to name them here in a little while, but those were the 3 main ones that I just mentioned to you. So as Jeremiah begins his ministry, Assyria is the world superpower. But Assyria is in decline. And in the wings, just waiting for that to happen, is Egypt and Babylon and the Medes and the Persians. And so they're just waiting for Assyria to fall so that they could take over in succession. And we talked a little bit about the history of that succession when we were in Isaiah. Now, much like today, I believe this country that we live in is in decline. It's been weakened by debt. It's been weakened by moral depravity. It's been weakened by attacks on the covenant of marriage and on the sanctity of life. And America, at some point, is no longer going to be considered a world superpower. And we know that prophetically this is going to come true because when Russia and Iran and Turkey and the Ezekiel 38 war, when they come against Israel, America's nowhere to be heard from. They're nowhere in sight. And in the wings, just waiting for America's decline, is Russia and China. Now, Jeremiah saw a lot of changes in his tenure as God's prophet. Saw a lot of changes in the nation of Judah and specifically the nations around them. Judah had become a vassal nation under Assyria, meaning they were under the control and protection of Assyria. And so that lasted for a while. But then there was a period of time where Judah gained their independence again. Then they lost it again as they became a vassal nation of Egypt. And then once again to Babylon as they were captured and carried away and the city and the temple were burned. And Jeremiah lived through all of this and got to minister and prophesy through all of it. Contemporaries of Jeremiah were Ezekiel, Daniel, Zephaniah, Nahum, and Habakkuk. Now, Jeremiah is born during the end of the reign of Manasseh. And that name may ring a bell if you've ever read the Kings. Manasseh, the Bible tells us, did evil in the sight of the Lord. In fact, he was one of the most evil kings ever to reign in Judah. He pushed a pro-Assyrian agenda. He wanted everybody to submit to the Assyrians. He allowed the worship of the Assyrian gods and even the pagan practices, which included sacrificing children to the god Moloch. Now, if you remember, there were 39 kings in Israel after the death of Solomon, and the kingdom split, right? Only 9 of those 39 kings, only 9 of them were good kings. All the rest were evil. All of the kings in Israel were evil. All 9 of those kings that were good reigned at some point in Judah. So Jeremiah had to deal with both good kings and bad kings during his ministry. And that's not unlike today, is it? Because sometimes we minister under good and bad presidents. And I'll leave that up to you as to what state we're in right now. Now, there have been 46 U.S. presidents. Some good, some great. 2 of my favorites, Reagan and Lincoln. Washington's right up there with them. There have been some who have been mediocre and some who are just outright terrible. And like Jeremiah, we must learn to minister in the good times and the bad, under the good presidents and the bad presidents, under the mediocre presidents and even the terrible ones. Now, Jeremiah begins his ministry when 8-year-old Josiah, who was a good king, by the way, in Judah, the last of them, and he reigned for 31 years, but that's when Jeremiah begins his ministry. So Jeremiah is called by Jehovah to be the messenger to his backslidden people. People who had drifted away from God. People who had not only drifted away from God, but were ignorant of their condition. You know, for that reason alone, Jeremiah could be our prophet today, couldn't he? Because this country, which was founded on biblical principles, most of our founding fathers were God-fearing men, but this nation has drifted far, far, far away from God. It is in a backslidden state, and this nation, for the most part, is ignorant of that condition, aren't they? So just as it was in the days of Judah under Jeremiah, it is in the days that we live in today. So God sends his servant Jeremiah with God's word in his mouth for a people who, despite the warnings, kept turning away from God. Jeremiah was grieved over the wickedness of the nation, grieved of the impending judgment of his people. And sadly, all of the warnings that he gave the people from God went unheeded. So Jeremiah responded to their lack of caring about what God thought of them with tears of mourning. Jeremiah 13 verse 17 says, "But if you will not listen, my soul will weep in secret for your pride. My eyes will weep bitterly and run down with tears because the Lord's flock has been taken captive." Jeremiah is called the weeping prophet, partly because of the doom and gloom messages that he had to give, but mostly because of the grief that he expressed for the people of Judah. I want to read you how one commentator put this in perspective for our day. If Jeremiah was preaching today, suppose I, your pastor, stood up here on a Sunday morning or a Wednesday night, and I started preaching that God is going to send our enemies, terrorists, to punish the United States of America, to punish us, because God does not want any part of our religious worship. It's an offense to him. And that's why God's going to use our enemies, the terrorists, to bring about the destruction of this nation. I doubt if I preached that enough times that would be a very popular message, wouldn't it? Unpopular, I would say. Probably met with a lot of criticism and rejection. So now you know what Jeremiah faced in his ministry, because that's exactly what he was called to do. He was despised and rejected because he told Judah what God told him to say. That God was going to send their enemy, Babylon, against them. And that they would be taken into captivity for 70 years in Babylon. And the only chance they had of surviving that attack was to surrender. You'll find that in Jeremiah 21, verses 9 through 10. But in their arrogance, they would never listen to Jeremiah. Even though Jeremiah spoke the words of God, they hated him and they persecuted him. Yet Jeremiah remained faithful to speak the words that God told him to speak, day in and day out, no matter how much persecution he faced, no matter what they thought of him, no matter what they did to him. He preached the word that God gave him to preach. And arguably, of all the prophets, Jeremiah suffered the most of all of them. Each prophet had a distinct message. For instance, Ezekiel's message is about the glory and majesty of God. Isaiah's message overall was about the coming of salvation through the coming Messiah. So at least those prophets saw some kind of impact in the nation that they witnessed to or they prophesied to, but not Jeremiah. He faithfully preached the message that God gave him day in and day out for 40 years with absolutely no success. Now, some would claim, looking at those ministry statistics, that his ministry was a failure. But God would call Jeremiah's ministry a ministry of faithfulness. You see, we're not responsible for the outcome of the message, of the gospel that we preach. We're only responsible to preach the message. And Jeremiah did just that faithfully for 40 years. So let's dig into the book of Jeremiah. Jeremiah chapter 1, verses 1 and 3. The words of Jeremiah, the son of Hilkiah, one of the priests who were at Anathoth in the land of Benjamin, to whom the word of the Lord came in the days of Josiah, the son of Ammon, king of Judah, in the 13th year of his reign. It came also in the days of Jehoiakim, the son of Josiah, king of Judah, and until the end of the 11th year of Zedekiah, the son of Josiah, king of Judah, until the captivity of Jerusalem in the 5th month. So Jeremiah grows up in a town called Anathoth, and that town, by the way, was where all the priests lived. So imagine being a kid in a town where all the priests are looking out their window watching what you're doing, right? Now, we don't know for sure, but his father may have been the very same Hilkiah, which, by the way, was a very common name in that day, that was a high priest. The high priest who actually found the law of Moses tucked away somewhere in the temple and brought it to light. So Jeremiah may have been the son of that high priest. We don't know for sure, but what we do know for sure is that he is a prophet called by God to speak the word of God to the nations. And he sets out to do that. And as he does, he faces many, many, many obstacles, one of which is he's a prophet to a divided land. 1 Kings chapter 12, verse 16 through 19, so we're going to do a little history tonight. When all of Israel saw that the king did not listen to them, the people answered the king, "What portion do we have with David? We have no inheritance in the son of Jesse. Take to your tents, O Israel. Look now to your own house, David." So Israel went to their tents. But Rehoboam reigned over the people of Israel who lived in the city of Judah. And King Rehoboam sent Adoram, who was the taskmaster over the forced labor, to all Israel, stoned him to death with stones. And King Rehoboam hurried to mount his chariot to flee to Jerusalem. So Israel has been in rebellion against the house of David to this day. Now Rehoboam was Solomon's son. He was the rightful heir to be king over the nation of Israel. Jeroboam was a servant who had rebelled against Solomon. So all the tribes of Benjamin, along with the Levites, remained with Rehoboam, and all the other tribes, the 10 tribes, went with Jeroboam as their king, and then the nation split into the northern and southern kingdoms. That split was prophesied in 1 Kings chapter 11, verses 11 through 13, and verses 29 through 39. And the split occurred because of Solomon's sin. And I want to read you that verse in 1 Kings 11:11. "Since it has been your practice, you've not kept my covenant and my statutes that I've commanded you, I shall surely tear the kingdom from you and will give it to your servant." And that servant, of course, is Jeroboam. So the northern 10 kingdoms kept the name of Israel, and the southern 2 tribes kept the name of Judah. So this once unified 12 tribes of Israel were now split. These nations, these brothers, if you will, have become enemies. And Jeremiah is ministering now to a divided kingdom. And he would weep over the fate of Judah, over the fate of Israel. And he had a lot of reason to weep over their fate, because in 721 BC, Assyria swept in from the north, captured the northern kingdom of Israel, and took them captive. And as Jeremiah begins his prophecy, his ministry in Judah, they are about to be taken captive into Babylon for 70 years. So as I said, as he begins his ministry, Josiah, the last good king in Judah, is on the throne. Josiah began his reign at the ripe old age of 8 years old because his father had been assassinated, so he ascended to the throne that way. And he would lead Judah in the last revival the nation would ever experience before the captivity. And Jeremiah would go on to preach this message that God had given him through 5 kings. Josiah, Jehoahaz, who was only on the throne for 3 months, Jehoiakim, who again was one of the most evil kings in all of Judah, Jehoiachin, who had been taken captive by Nebuchadnezzar, he was only on the throne for 3 months, and Zedekiah, the last of the kings, who Jeremiah served under, who became a puppet ruler under Nebuchadnezzar. And in the 3rd and final siege of Judah, Zedekiah is caught trying to escape, and Nebuchadnezzar has them put his eyes out in front of his sons. So that's the kings that Jeremiah served under. And although the rest were taken captive in that final siege. All of Jerusalem were taken captive. There was still a remnant. And part of that remnant, Jeremiah was part of it. And he and the rest of them were allowed to stay in Jerusalem. So Jeremiah never went to Babylon. Jeremiah had spent years of his life warning that this day would come. Yet they ignored him. They continued to turn their backs on God and worship other gods. Does that sound familiar today? We've been telling others for years that Jesus is coming to take his bride to church home with him. And most do not pay attention to our warnings. There's so many parallels with what happened in Jeremiah's day as compared to what's happening in our day. For instance, Israel and Judah were to trust in God, yet they relied on false gods to lead them. And you think about this nation, right? How was our country founded? Well, I'm just going to read you part of our Declaration of Independence, which says, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. They are endowed by their Creator, God, with certain unalienable rights, that among those are life, liberty, and the pursuit of holiness." On our money, what does it say? Trust in God. But you know, if those things were voted on today, there would be no mention of God in any historical documents in this country or on any American currency. God has been taken out of our schools, out of our workplaces, and out of the halls of our government. The name of Jesus is barely spoken from the pulpits in this nation. We are a nation in spiritual crisis, just as it was in Judah during Jeremiah's ministry. Instead of trusting in God's providence as we once did, we trust in man to provide what we need. We, too, are in spiritual decay and in a decline of our superpower, just as Judah was in that day. Not that Judah was a superpower. Look at verse 4. "Now the word of the Lord came to me, saying, Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. And before you were born, I consecrated you. I appointed you a prophet to the nations. Then I said, Lord God, behold, I do not know how to speak, for I am only a youth. But the Lord said to me, Do not say I am only a youth, for to all to whom I send you, you shall go. And whatever I command you, you shall speak. Do not be afraid of them, for I am with you to deliver you, declares the Lord." If you don't have that underlined or highlighted in your Bible, you should. Do not be afraid of them, for I am with you to deliver you, declares the Lord. Before Jeremiah is even born, God had chosen him to be the prophet. And please take note of this, to the nations. To the nations, not just Judah, but to the nations. Even to our nation. Jeremiah is a prophet to America. Now, is America mentioned here? No. But what we're going to learn in the book of Jeremiah, the same principles that are in Jeremiah, the same thing that God is accusing Judah of doing, we've done. So those same principles that we're going to find in this book apply to us, I believe. And the words that God gave him to speak to Judah and to the nations surrounding them are words that we should take to heart today. So the question for us as a people, as a nation, is will we listen to the warnings contained in this message? Or are we going to ignore them like Judah did and suffer the consequences? Now notice God told Jeremiah that he formed him in the womb, that he was consecrated to do the work of God even before he was born. And God told him this, I believe, to encourage him, because there were going to be days in Jeremiah's ministry where he's just going to say, oy vey, I can't take this anymore. And so he's going to remember that this wasn't something that he thought up, that he did. This was something the Lord called him to do. And hopefully that would strengthen him and encourage him. Because if God knew what Jeremiah was going to do even before he was born, then God knew all the persecutions Jeremiah would face. God knew all the rejection Jeremiah would face. God knew everything. And so therein lies the very foundations of why we pray. We're praying to the one who formed us in the womb. We're praying to the one who consecrated us to do what he's called us to do, and mainly that's to preach the gospel message. So when things get tough in our lives, God will lead us and encourage us through even the toughest of times because he's the one that called us to it. And he knows before whatever happens in our life what's going to happen. And so we pray to him for leading and for guiding. You know, it's funny. When a nation is in crisis, just like America, it turns to a leader. And that leader is usually a man, president, or one day could be a woman. One day the world's going to turn to a world leader who's going to bring peace in the Middle East. And that leader is going to be the Antichrist. But listen, God knows when a nation is in crisis, and God chose to use a baby. To choose a baby. A baby as it's being formed in the womb, where God says he knew him even before he was born. Even before Jeremiah was born, even before you and I were born, we were made in the likeness of God to serve God. The psalmist wrote, "For you formed my inward parts, you knitted me together in my mother's womb. I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made." God made Jeremiah, and he made you and I for a purpose. You know, a baby has unlimited potential, doesn't it? Especially in the hands of God. God sees outside of time. He's not bound by space and time as we are. So he sees the past, present, and future at the same time. Meaning he could see crises that arise in nations and in our lives years, decades before they actually happen. And in this case, he saw the crisis in Judah and decided to use a baby. He already chose him and consecrated him in the womb before he was ever born to meet the crisis that was going to happen in Judah. That's one of the many reasons why God calls abortion an abomination, the shedding of innocent blood. It's an abomination. With the millions of babies lost, think of all the potential. Think of one of those babies could have had the cure for cancer. Could have been could have had peace agreements signed. They could have been scientists, doctors, engineers, leaders of nations. Who knows the potential they had? You know, I think of, because you know I love history, think of George Washington. George Washington was one of those babies. One of those babies that God chose before he was formed in the womb for a particular crisis. And that crisis was the forming of the United States of America. God knew that the United States of America would need a leader to get them through what threatened to derail this nation before we ever even began to fight for it. God knew that George Washington, before he was formed in his mother's womb, was a God-fearing man. And that God would use him to not only lead this fledgling nation to independence, but also to guide this new nation through the establishment of a constitution and for the first 8 years of its existence. God chose him to do that. Just like he chose Jeremiah in time of crisis for Judah. And so it makes us wonder, or at least it makes me wonder, why we have who we have in office right now. Was he chosen from his birth to lead this nation? According to the Bible, I would think that's a yes. You know, Washington was chosen to lead this nation as it was born. And the president we have right now and the ones who will follow him will be used of God to bring this nation to its decline. Nobody is in that office by mistake. Remember, God sets those in power and removes those from power. Now, God used America to stop the Germans and the Axis powers of evil from taking over before it was time, right? And he's going to use this president and ones who follow to usher in the Antichrist, who's going to try and take over the world, only to be stopped by the return of Jesus Christ. God is in control. And God tells Jeremiah, "Do not say, I am only a youth. For to all whom I send you, you shall go, and whatever I command you, you shall speak." Now, many scholars believe that he's only 16, 17, maybe 18 years old when he begins this ministry. But God knew that Jeremiah would be obedient no matter what the cost. That wherever God sent him, he would go. Whatever God told him to say, no matter how unpopular, no matter how much persecution he faced, he would say it. God didn't leave it up to Jeremiah, did he? To go where he wanted to go. Because If I was Jeremiah, I'd go to where all my friends are, right? I'd go someplace where it was comfortable, where they wouldn't reject me. He didn't leave it up to Jeremiah to say what he wanted to say, because if I'm Jeremiah, I don't want to be so unpopular. So maybe I compromise a little. Maybe I tell them what they want to hear. Maybe I tickle their ears a little bit, just to keep myself from being beaten and abused and locked up all the time. I wouldn't personally do that, but I'm just saying it's possible that Jeremiah may have made that choice. But instead, God sends him to a place where they didn't want him. They didn't want him there. They didn't want him in Judah. And he gave him a message that nobody in Judah wanted to hear. Listen, we've been called today to preach the gospel message, right? That's God's word to us. And we're going to go to places where we're not welcomed. We're going to talk to people that don't want to hear it. And like I said before, we're not responsible for how the message is received. We are only responsible for delivering the message. Even if that means that one day sharing the gospel gets us arrested, or gets us terminated from our job, or alienated from our family. Some of the stuff I've been posted about Israel, I'm surprised some of my family's still talking to me in support of Israel, which, by the way, boggles my mind that there's not more of that on the internet. But I'll save that for another day. Because God tells Jeremiah, do not be afraid of them, for I am with you. I will deliver you, declares the Lord. Don't be afraid. God is with us. And that not only goes for us being bold to share the word, but boldness to live the way he's called us to live. So fear not, because he's with us. God knew that Jeremiah would be as bold as a lion when it came to doing what God had called him to do. Look at verses 9 through 10. Then the Lord put out his hand and touched my mouth. And the Lord said to me, behold, I put my words in your mouth. See, I have set you this day over nations and over kingdoms, to pluck up and to break down, to destroy and to overthrow, to build and to plant. Now, reminiscent of God touching the mouth of Isaiah with the burning coal to purify the message that he was called to give, God puts his pure and holy word into the mouth of Jeremiah. And from this point forward, he's going to speak the words that God placed in his mouth to the nations. And God's given him authority over the nations to speak what God is going to do to them. Nations like Assyria, Egypt, Babylon, Judah. And although our nation is still thousands of years away from even being born, the principles contained in these prophecies pertain to us as well. And Jeremiah is given the authority to preach to the nations that they will be uprooted and their foundations will be broken down, and that some nations will be overthrown and destroyed, and some will be planted, and some will be built up. And the word of the Lord came to me, saying, Jeremiah, what do you see? And I said, I see an almond branch. And the Lord said to me, you have seen well, for I am watching over my word to perform it. And this is kind of a play on words here. The Jews would call an almond tree the watcher, because it was the first tree to bloom in the spring. And so they saw it watching the return of the sun and the warmth, and how it would signal the beginning of springtime. And so God's telling Jeremiah, I'm watching over my word to make sure that you deliver it as it's spoken. And that God would be quick to fulfill his word, just as that first leaf of the almond tree would be quick to signal the coming of springtime. The word of the Lord came to me a second time, saying, what do you see? And I said, I see a boiling pot facing away from the north. And the Lord said to me, out of the north disaster shall be let loose upon all the inhabitants of the land. For behold, I am calling all the tribes and the kingdoms of the north, declares the Lord. And they shall come, and everyone shall set his throne at the entrance of the gates of Jerusalem against all its walls, all around and against all the cities of Judah. And I will declare my judgments against them, for all their evil is forsaking me. They have made offerings to other gods and worshipped the works of their own hands. So the first vision Jeremiah is given is one of an almond tree, and the second one is one of a boiling pot. And pay close attention to the placement of that pot, right? It's facing away from the north, meaning that when it boils over, when that hot boiling water begins to rush out, it's going to flow to the south. And that's where Judah is. And this is a clear prophetic word. The judgment is coming from the north against Judah. And God gives them a reason for the judgment. They had forsaken God. That word means they've deserted him. They've walked away from him. They've made offerings to other gods. And so they're giving worship that only belongs to God to their false gods. And they worship their own works. They worship the creation rather than the Creator. Does any of those charges against Judah apply to any other nations? Does it apply to our nation? As I said, this country was founded on the principles of the Bible, but we've walked away from God. We worship money, power, and fame. We worship the work of our hands rather than the God who made all things. You know, when we finished up Isaiah last week, the first two verses of that last chapter, chapter 66, says this: Heaven is my throne and the earth is my footstool. What is the house that you would build for me? And what is the place of my rest? All these things my hand has made. And so all these things came to be, declares the Lord. But this is the one to whom I will look, he who is humble and contrite in spirit and trembles at my word. God's not impressed by anything man could build. He's not impressed with the skyscrapers in New York City. He just isn't. And King Solomon said, But will God indeed dwell on the earth? Behold, heaven and the highest heaven cannot contain you. How much less this house that I have built? The heavens can't contain the glory of the Lord. How could anything that man could possibly build, no matter how high it is, contain God's glory? Besides, everything used in the building of anything man builds, God created anyway. So God doesn't find rest in anything made by man, and he isn't impressed by the work of man's hands. What does impress God, however, is a humble man with a contrite spirit. God prefers a humble heart over a magnificent structure built by any man. But there's a little more to this. They had been placing their confidence and faith in the work of man, just like we do today. We look to man to save us. You know, a nation that walks away from God and places their trust in man will eventually die. And because of this, because our nation is doing just this, we're seeing a demise of this once great nation. And the reason this nation was once great is because it trusted in God. But you, dress yourself for work. Arise and say to them everything that I commanded you. Do not be dismayed by them, lest I dismay you before them. And I, behold, I make you this day a fortified city, an iron pillar, the bronze walls against the whole land, against the kings of Judah, its officials, its priests, the people of the land. They will fight against you, but they will not prevail against you. For I am with you, declares the Lord, to deliver you. God is going to fortify Jeremiah. God is going to give him the strength to do what he's called him to do. And what does he call them to do? Pretty much get everybody mad at him. Everybody in the land. You know, Paul wrote to the Romans, what then shall we say of these things? If God is for us, who can be against us? That's a great verse, isn't it? It's uplifting. It's encouraging. But to answer Paul's question, everyone and everything can be against us. And sometimes that's exactly how it feels, doesn't it? But the key to that verse is that no matter who's against you, no matter what's against you, God is for you. And that's exactly what Jeremiah faced as he began his ministry. God didn't leave anybody out here. He tells him the kings, the priests, the officials, all the people. If I left anybody out, all the people, the whole entire land is going to be against you. But God tells him, don't fear, because I am with you. I am fortifying you. I am building you up. I am strengthening you. And they're not going to prevail against you. And I, for one, love those odds. I'll take those odds every day. All of Judah against Jeremiah and God. You can't lose. We have those same odds in our favor. Whoever or whatever that comes against us, we have God on our side. You know, when we were kids, there was always that one kid that you always wanted on your team, right? Because you knew if you had that kid on your team, you were going to win. But we have God on our team. And we are assured victory every single time because he's there with us. Remember what God said to Jeremiah. Do not be afraid of them, for I am with you to deliver you, declares the Lord. God says to us, I will never leave you or forsake you. Take that promise as your own. Let's pray.